Okay, so another scintillating video about how to do something for the course. This time we're going to be talking about what I refer to, what are actually called primary source analyses. Now, despite my best efforts, despite the fact that I have actually already provided you with the ones that you need for the very first one of these primary source analyses, some of you are still going to miss the point. So I'm going to try very hard right this minute to clarify this paragraph right here. A primary source is a document or an artifact or a piece of artwork or an image or something that was created in the past by someone who was alive at the time it was created. Historians, as a rule, work with written sources. The word history actually means the study of written things. Um, so we tend to prefer those. But because this is a World Civ course, and because we are starting with this first primary source analysis, um, including many of the archaic citations as well as later ones, what we're effectively looking at is the idea that you have the option to use different types of sources. Now, I have specifically chosen for you the ones to use for this first one, and they are all written. But if you want to use something else, if you want to use uh, a photograph of a figurine or an archaeological find or some image that was created in the past, you can do that, but you have to get approval from me first. If you're going outside of the sources I give you, you need to get approval from me beforehand, and it needs to be no later than next Saturday. This first paper is due Monday by midnight. Yes, I know it's Labor Day. Yes, you've known since the beginning of the course that this was due in the third week. You can turn it in anytime you want in this coming week. In fact, you could already have turned it in if you'd wanted to, even though I should have preferred that you not until you've been through this, so you have some idea of what you're doing. But just because it's Labor Day does not mean that you haven't had enough warning that you could have gotten it in beforehand. So I will not be tolerating very many excuses for lateness. If you can't get it in on Monday and you don't have a valid reason, as in you've waited till the last minute to do this and suddenly discovered it's a lot harder than you thought it was, yeah, sorry, that's not going to cut it. So if you are going to be late with it, in order not to have the 10% per day penalty on it, you need to let me know prior to the due time, and you need to have a legitimate and valid reason for it not to be on time. All right? So just getting all of that out of the way first up. If you want to go and use a source that is not ones that I have given you to choose from, then you need to get approval from me no later than Saturday before it's due, because I am not planning to be available. I have other jobs I have to do, so I will not be available very much over the weekend. So you need to get that approval from me earlier rather than later. Do not wait until Monday, because I won't even, I'm not even sure I'm going to see emails on Monday. So don't wait till Monday to do it. All right. With all of that in mind, then, the primary source analyses require you to use at least 3 primary sources. I've stipulated written ones again because this is a history course, and that's kind of what we do. We study the written word. The choices that I have already given for you are listed in the one for the first primary source analysis, and I'll get to that in just a minute. If you have chosen one of the hard copy textbooks by Von Summers or Strayer and Nelson or even Bentley that have sources in them, a lot of those are really good sources as well. And you are welcome to use one of those as long, again, as you email me first and get my approval. A secondary source is effectively what you'll be writing, because a secondary source is where someone living after that period of time, like, I don't know, today, takes primary sources, analyzes them, and discusses what they mean in terms of assessing a time period or assessing a topic. So what you're effectively writing are secondary sources, and that's basically what most historians do. We take ideas, we take writings written in a certain time period that we've become particularly focused on or done a lot of research on, and analyze those to give us a better, broader view of that time period. A tertiary source is something like your textbook or an encyclopedia. It is a book or source that is written principally for the purposes of teaching. Um, it tends to work on the majority accepted ideas about the time period by most historians studying that time period at the time that it's written. So this is all a big part of where we are with what sourcing is. Um, Again, the primary source analyses that you're going to be doing are going to require you to use 3 primary sources and discuss them and the perspectives of the people who wrote them, kind of like your discussion posts are supposed to include that pers uh, perspective by the peoples who are writing the other sources that you're writing. Those are primarily secondary sources. Harari would be a secondary source. Diamond's a secondary source. Um, For your primary source analyses, you will obviously be using those as well as your textbook to put your primary sources into context as you address these questions. All right, so with all of that in mind, if again, and I'm also pointing this out because for your second, third, and fourth primary sources analyses, you're actually going to be picking the primary sources. So that's part of why it's important for you to understand what a primary source is, especially when you're out there looking for them yourself, but also to know places where you can find them. Again, I've provided the ones for the first ones, but for 2, 3, and 4, you're going to be out there looking for them. So if you have chosen a textbook that has sources in it, that's an excellent place to start. The Internet History Sourcebook Project, which some of you have seen already, is another really good place. And also, I have put primary sources, as you hopefully have noticed, in every week of our course. They're actually in a folder on the content page for that week, somewhere at the bottom that says primary sources. So you can look at those as well. All right, all of that being said, as with everything else, of course, that you turn into me, citations mandatory, internal as well as external. And in order for me to grade you on the assumption that you've actually used a primary source, obviously you must cite it. And preferably when you're talking about it, you're going to use a quote from it. So that's going to definitely require that you use that internal citation. You'll also need your works cited page, which should of course list all 3 of your primary sources, as well as your textbook, as well as Harari, Diamond, any other sources that you're using to make the argument. All right, once again, I have given you examples of how to cite. Here's your internal citation. This would be a primary source citation from a piece written by Pope Clement VI, him, the date, and because it was a published document, the page that it was on, right? All right, and as with your discussions, I actually have a rubric. In this case, the rubric is going to include, again, your general knowledge. That's where you're going to demonstrate what you know about the issue and the time periods in which it evolved based on the textbook and on your secondary readings. Critical thinking, a lot of this is going to go into your historical support, particularly historical support from your primary sources. But there's also a primary source category as well. And in this one, the distinguished is going to be based on your analysis of the sources and the bias of the authors who wrote them. The example I normally give when we're talking about perspective is the idea that when you're reading a document, if you find something from the past that disturbs you, that normally means that there's something that the author of that document takes for granted because it was part of his or her everyday life. It was just something that happened. Uh, Violence is one of those things that we tend to notice a lot in particularly ancient and classical civilizations in their documents, that it's common for people to talk about beating slaves or even beating free men or women of a lower economic class. When you're reading something and it makes you uncomfortable, That normally demonstrates the bias of the person who wrote it, and that their bias is very different from our bias today, or our perspective today. And that's pretty much what I'm trying to get you to. When you analyze these documents, one of the things you need to take into account is how the lifestyle of the person who wrote it is very different, as it were, from how we see things today. And times, if you're really proficient in a time period, or if you're using three sources that have differing views on the same thing, it can be particularly interesting, right? So that's part of what you want to talk about, and that's part of why when we get into this distinguished thing, it is that you are taking at least one paragraph somewhere in the course of the paper, usually towards the end, and talking about the perspectives and biases and comparing them of the authors of your three primary sources, right? All right, citation, obviously, very similar to that in the discussions. It is mandatory that you have your citations, and that you write this in such a way that it is reasonably easy for me to understand. The harder I have to struggle to understand your points, the lower your grade's going to be. All right, so these are all worth 8% of your final grade each, for a total of 32%. And as we go along, they are going to get hopefully better and better. Now, I haven't addressed this yet. I'll mention this now. But yes, towards once we get past the halfway point in the course, I'll start giving you some extra credit options as well. But for right now, you definitely want to be sure that you pay attention to what you're doing with these primary source analyses. That all being said, I have here the first primary source analysis, also called a journal analysis, the topic of which is patriarchy and the history and establishment. All right, so to further help you with what I've been talking about in all of your primary sources, I have linked in some videos that talk about bias in primary sources and how to identify it, how to analyze a primary source. If you need it, making sense of sources. And this first one, what is historical thinking? That is a lot about what I just mentioned. It goes more in depth into this idea about what historians do and how we go about doing, right? Okay, as I mentioned, for your first paper, I have given you some documents from which to choose so that you don't have to go look for anything. There are 9 sources here. You only need 3. I encourage you to read through all of them to see which ones would work best with whatever issues you want to address in the question, right? But there are 9 here. You choose 3. Again, if you want to use something that's not here, if there's something in your textbook that you like better, if there's something somewhere else that you like better, I'm fine with it. Just be sure that you ask me first. Get that approval from me via email early on in the process. All right. So using your textbook, the other required readings for the past 3 weeks, and that means, of course, Harari, it means Diamond, it means the Britannica article on the Stone Age. Anything that has been required in any of the discussions is going to be required in this as well. So be sure you're using those references. Discuss the history of patriarchy. How and why does it evolve? How is it related to the agricultural revolution? How is it related to the development of this thing we call civilization? How and why does civilization, this thing that we will be working on some kind of weird definition for, need hierarchy and social roles? Is living in civilization better or worse than being in a hunter-gatherer society? Why? All right, so it's going to be a nice little essay in which you're going to address all of those issues, and you're going to use your primary sources to justify or support your argument. There should also then be this included, what biases are present in the primary sources, but also in your textbook and the supplemental readings for the past 3 weeks. What's your bias? Why do you have that bias? Why did you choose the 3 primary sources you chose? And why didn't you choose other ones? That doesn't necessarily mean you need to list all 9 of them, but you need to have a pretty good idea about why you chose the 3 you chose and how they fit into your argument. All right, of course, as mentioned, ad infinitum, citation mandatory internally and with a works cited, and I'll again make this very clear, no internal citation is a 0. For this, you must use quotes. And as we all know at this point, if you're quoting, you must cite immediately after it, right? All right. Now, part of what we're doing here is this thing called historiography, which is, in a short synopsis, the history of the writing of history and how the way we tell the story of history has changed. I encourage you to consider that as you are working on your paper. While I don't, in this particular primary source analysis, require you to go into that, by the end of the course, you will have specific questions. Well, actually, starting in the midterm, you'll have specific questions on the midterm and on the final, talking about how the way we tell the story of history has changed. So you definitely need to have some working knowledge of what historiography is. This particular video by Mark Bowles is really, really good. All of these are actually really good ones talking about what historiography is and how, as society has changed, the way we tell the story of the past has also changed. All right, notes for a thorough journal entry. I have these just like I do on the discussion post, ways to get them, um, to get your grade uh, good, which I assume you all want. Be sure you use your 3 primary sources. Don't just reference them, but use them. Use information from them, specifics from them, quotes from them to support your arguments and your ideas. Consider the bias of the person who wrote it or their perspective. What do they take for granted? Why did they write it? Bearing in mind that up until effectively the last 200 years, writing was not something everybody could do. So when you're looking at a lot of the documents that you're going to be seeing throughout this course, they're being written by a select group of people, normally very elite people in the societies from which they come. Again, not everybody read and wrote because there just was no time for that. The vast majority of people were producing food. They didn't have the need to read or write. If they did, somebody did it for them. So for the most part, the people who could read and write were a very tiny percentage of the population. They were, for the most part, male, and they were, for the most part, from the very upper levels of the society. So bear that in mind. When you're talking about the document, why was it written? Why did somebody deem the information in it important enough to be written down? Who was it being written for? Who was the audience for it? That's another part of the motivation for the writing of it. How does the written word of the document, how is it supposed to influence somebody? And what can you tell that in the writing of that document was left out? What did whoever wrote it not deem important enough to include, right? All right, so again, here's your basic rubric, the grading structure, again, based on the 8-point scale, as it were. As with all of them, I will convert it to um, an actual numeric grade out of 100 for you, but obviously you want a 6 or better because that's going to get you into the B range. All right, very last thing, I will email this to you and I will email with it a sample primary source analyses from somebody who did a very good job. My comments in that on things they could have done better will be highlighted and in yellow so that you can see also what they could have done better and think about how it would apply to your paper. I will also be emailing, of course, the journal rubric as well. So get started on this. If you have questions, please feel free to email me. But again, do not wait until the last minute because I may not be available to answer all of your emails. Best of luck.